So anyway, I'm super thrilled to be able to talk to you and hope that I get to attend one of your events in person next year or in the near future. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And there we go. So I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about what's happening here at the federal level, but I'm really going to talk more about what's happening at the national level and things that we can use the new infrastructure bill to do better. My organization, Transportation for America, like Nina said, is focused on connecting people to jobs and essential services, no matter how they travel, no matter how much money they make, and where they live. And so we have prioritized a handful of things. One is putting a focus on maintaining the system we have and getting the most out of it before we invest in new things. We have seen a pattern of in some parts of the country of building something new or expanding something while backlogs continue to grow. And some states do better at this than others, but at the federal level, we are agnostic on it. And if you would like to allow some of your rural roads to go to dirt while building massive new highways, that is permissible. And there are some states that take them up on it. And we'd like to see investment in the communities we have already first. Two is designing for safety over speed. We have built up a transportation program around building separated highways, but then we've taken a lot of those designs and applied it in a one-size-fits-all way across the country, even where there are points of huge conflict. And that speed creates a big problem, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And connecting people to jobs and essential services, no matter how they travel. Actually, one of the things we've worked with several states and cities and metropolitan planning authorities on has been on using the technology that we all use in our smartphones, the mapping technologies that allows us to look at multiple ways to get to the same points of destination and bring that technology that isn't even that new anymore into the transportation program to be able to plan on a more multimodal basis and to be able to make sure we are serving people whether they can afford a car or not. Now, the infrastructure bill itself, it's a very large bill, $645 billion for transportation over 5 years. That's a 113% increase over our current spending for all forms of surface transportation. There's a big increase in highly flexible formula funds that go to the states. There are some strings attached, but not a lot. There are some regulatory issues like the National Environmental Policy Act and historic preservation and things like that. But basically, there's an enormous amount of flexibility to spend that money according to state and local priorities. And there's a large portion of new competitive funds. I will say that this bill really keeps the status quo. It does not address any of the 3 transportation priorities except in small bits. The tradition in transportation, particularly at the federal level, has been you identify a problem, maybe it is safety. You create a small program to retrofit the overall system to make it safer, while the overwhelming majority of the funds go to create more of the problem that the small program is supposed to fix. It doesn't work real well, but it makes everybody feel like they got what they wanted in terms of improving that problem, safety, without threatening the status quo. It just doesn't move things forward. So the main point of the bill is that I want to get across is states can do what they've been doing, or they can make changes, and it will be very much in their hands how this money gets spent and what priorities they seek to prioritize. I will say that we have not been performing very well in the transportation program. Many areas have a pretty big backlog. Many areas do not provide alternatives to driving, certainly not safe alternatives. Our safety performance, particularly in the past 2 years overall, has been terrible. Over the long run, it's been really bad for vulnerable travelers, those traveling outside of a car. Traffic, it has not gotten better in any of the largest 100 cities. In fact, it's gotten substantially worse, even in places losing population, no matter how much new lanes they build. And the cost of transportation, both to the taxpayer and to the household, has gone up. So there are things that we should look to change and use as much of the tools we have to do so. And thankfully, because of the flexibility in the program, there's a lot of ability to do that. Unfortunately, because of the flexibility in the program, there's a lot of ability to not do that. So before I jump into some of those problems that I mentioned, I want to I'm going to start in safety. And a lot of where my organization works is in complete streets. In fact, I was in the room where we created that term back about 15 years ago, complete streets. And I want to bring us all onto, kind of to level set on what I mean by complete streets. So these are all examples of complete streets. I don't have any urban examples in this. I think people have probably seen more urban examples, but frankly, urban America often doesn't do a very good job in this space. Rural America really leads the way. Much of what we're trying to do in urban America is recreate the feeling of the rural village. The community on the right here is Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a beautiful town that can create a complete street even in a hilly territory. Up in the upper left is Irwin, Tennessee, a very, very small community. These are both under 5,000 people. Also can build beautiful complete streets and is really going heavy on investing in its downtown after really decades of ignoring it, recognizing it's the most valuable piece of real estate that exists in its area. And then I gave an example of a suburban complete street, which does tend to look very different. I will say the urban complete streets often look, when they're done well, much more like rural. Rural towns and urban areas often have more in common with each other than with suburban areas or the great wide open. But the reason we're looking at creating this environment again is because our performance is just terrible. My organization also includes the National Complete Streets Coalition, and we issue a report every 2 years called Dangerous by Design. And the trend for people biking and walking, this focuses on people walking, has been really bad. Over 10 years, we've seen a sizable increase in the number of people killed while walking. All but one state is doing worse. The only state not doing worse, which is Rhode Island, is just doing equally as bad, but nobody is doing better in this area. And we saw in 2020, a bubble burst. We had thought for decades that as people drove less, that crashes would go down and fatalities would go down. We thought that as people drove more, it did tend to push those things in a bad direction. Well, last year we found that VMT kind of dove down, but traffic deaths jumped up. And a lot of what we've heard from particularly the police is a substantial increase in speeding at very high speeds, but just generally that all travel speeds had increased so much that that speed in a conflict-rich zone created more opportunities for crash. And when those crashes happened at a higher speed than we're used to, it was more often fatal. Unfortunately, as we have seen driving bounce back somewhat, we're not back to the 2019 levels, we still saw those numbers go up. And what we find in Dangerous by Design is the very design of the roadway communicates very specific things to the driver. And unfortunately, it is misaligned with what the driver is going to encounter. We tend to build, the typical 5-lane wide road. The local governments don't help a lot because they allow for development that is pushed back from the roadway. And that communicates on a very subconscious level with the driver. It's wide open, it's straight, you shouldn't expect crossings, you shouldn't expect driveways, and you shouldn't expect people. You should just go because it's wide open. So without traffic congestion, that's exactly what people do. And even as we've seen driving increase, it's been a different kind of driving than it was in the past, with not quite the morning and evening peaks, and many more trips focused on non-work trips than work trips. In fact, before the pandemic, non-work trips were 80% of travel, 70% of vehicle miles traveled. It was 98% of our focus investment. It just was nowhere near the majority of actual human travel. And now that number has ticked up even further. And so we're starting to see traffic congestion at like 3:30 p.m. when everyone goes out to pick up kids from school and go to the grocery and stuff like that. And they've just increased those trips over the 80% that they were before. Those pedestrian fatalities are worse in poor areas by a substantial amount. We know that Black and Native Americans are way more at risk for dying while walking. We know that people over 70 are substantially more at risk. We actually see the risk go up until retirement, then it dips down. And then as people become more frail, it goes way back up. And just that generally follows travel trends. People travel more into their middle age, like me. When they retire, they travel a little bit less. And then even though the travel is less as people get older, they're so frail, they're just more likely to be severely injured or killed in any kind of crash. We see that the risk is about the same in rural and urban areas based on exposure. Rural folks, I remember being in a meeting in a rural area in Florida where a couple was there. Their son had passed away. He'd been struck by a car while walking on a rural road. And they expressed great frustration with the fact that people think that rural Americans don't walk because distances are long. And we got a bit of an earful that folks in rural America know that distances are longer. They take all trips longer. And that they're tired of urban folks not understanding, because maybe they won't walk 2 blocks, that rural folks will walk. And that was quite a lesson. But our design for speed, our very highway focused design, even though you're in a developed area that should be designed very much with conflict in mind, it narrows your view of the area. As you travel faster, you can't see as much. And then your reaction time is slower. Just thinking about reacting, you cover more territory, and your braking covers more territory. And then when you strike another car, or particularly a person, it's much more likely to be fatal. We see those numbers increase by really incredible amounts between 20, 30, and 40 miles per hour. At 20, 9 out of 10 people struck will live. Once you get up to 40, you're getting real close to only 1 out of 10 living. So speed has a multiple level of impact on the likelihood that a crash will occur and that it would be fatal. We also have some interesting rules in place where we do speed studies. So we build with something in mind, but then if a certain percentage, 15%, they call it 85th percentile speed. So basically, they want to set it where 85%, the 85 percentile and below are all going the speed limit. So if you designed it for 25, but people react by driving faster, we don't say, oh, what did we do wrong in the design that people aren't behaving the way we hoped they would? We say, oh, well, we throw up our hands. We're just going to raise the speed limit. And so we reward speeding. And we find that with every speed study, that speed just increases very much because, well, now that we know that we're planning for 35 miles per hour, the next time we resurface and put paint down, we do it to make sure that if people make mistakes at 35 miles per hour in a car, they've got wiggle room. Well, then that communicates a higher speed than 35 miles per hour to the driver. So they drive faster, you do a speed study, you raise it to 40 miles per hour, and the cycle just keeps repeating itself. So speed is very much the focus of the accommodation of speed is the focus of everything we do, in spite of the fact that we know that it creates serious problems in terms of danger. This gives you an idea of a road that as a driver, it's long, it's straight, you feel it's wide open. And so as a driver, that communicates to you, go fast. A road more like this one is going to say, ooh, I don't want to go fast on this. You don't have to put up a speed limit sign here. Most people are going to feel hemmed in. And when humans feel hemmed in, they want to go slower. I think about when I turn onto the alley by my house. I don't want to go fast. I'm afraid if I go fast, I'll run into a building. So I don't have to be told to go slow. Most people just aren't terribly reckless, and they follow what the design communicates. Here's an example of one of the odder designs that you see everywhere. It's called a slip lane, where you can turn without really slowing down. And we consider this to be safe. We tell the driver, you don't need to slow down. You just speed on through here. But if there's a person in the crosswalk, you have to stop on a dime. And we consider this to be an okay and totally safe form of design. And then if the driver messes up because at that speed they couldn't possibly stop in time, we blame the driver. We say, 94% of fatalities are caused by, human error. And maybe we blame the pedestrian who naturally sees that this is an incredibly unsafe situation. And so she's taking the shortest route across because she doesn't want to be exposed to danger for a second longer than she has to. But we'll call that human error as well. I would call this the quintessential example of design error. It sets up human error, and it sets people up to fail and then blame them for the failure we set people up for. This is kind of your typical 5-lane road. And again, it's straightforward. There aren't really trees at the road. There aren't buildings at the road. The lanes are actually a highway's width. This is what you expect to see on interstates. And we've got it on a surface road. You don't see a lot of crossings. So, when we're driving, we're not burning sugar to make decisions at every moment. If we did, we'd be exhausted by the time we arrive. This is not a decision about like who's going to pick up your kid tonight, after track practice. This is the sort of decision making you make when you walk along the street to figure out how much you have to pick your foot up. That sort of decision making comes from this design, which is saying this is wide open, speed away. In fact, this feels very much like 50 to 55 miles per hour to me. I bet it's signed at 45 miles per hour, and a speed study would shockingly show that people are going above the speed limit. But if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a very dark little silhouette there of a human. Now, because this is a highway design, there's been some really interesting research recently that shows that the driver suffers something called inattentional blindness. You wouldn't see a person on a highway. So even if we actually visually see them, we don't see them. It doesn't register because it doesn't make sense. This is a wide, fast straightaway. We shouldn't see children on bicycles or vehicles coming out of driveways. So that design problem creates a safety hazard. And the way our roadways are designed, you start by trying to figure out what speed of travel we want to accommodate. And then you've got to figure out how many cars are going to be on that road, because depending on the number of vehicles you expect at that speed, you're going to design differently. And then you think about what mistakes will someone make at that speed, and how do we make sure that those mistakes don't lead to crashes. Then you set a project budget, and then you think about issues like people on bicycles or walking and those accommodations. You can see by that very process that safety for everyone doesn't really fit in, and that those other things coming after the project budget are by design busting the budget. And then that can be an excuse for not considering it in the final project. But what we do design for, like I said, which is the speed and the amount of vehicles and how close together they are, we're seeking to see a very stable flow all through the day. That forced flow down at LOSF, which is, F for failure, right, is something we are really trying to avoid, and some areas won't even tolerate E or D. But one of the issues is you don't have to have traffic for very long to trigger that LOSF. And so you can have an empty road most of the day and then just a little bit of peak time, and that's a problem to us, even though we're not really getting terribly efficient use of the roadway. And this very issue leads us to say we don't have space for people outside of a car, or for businesses to be up by the road, or for parking, or whatever the other needs of the roadway are. And you get an issue like this on the right. This is a roadway that has some traffic. Maybe this is like LOSD, and or sometimes a day LOSF. The roadway on the left is LOSA. Now, which would you give an A or an F to in terms of the economy? I would argue the economy of the upper right-hand corner is probably a little bit better than the one in the left-hand corner, but this very traffic movement in transportation is equated with economic benefit. We see this in a bunch of places, so this roadway, which has since been filled in and turned into a boulevard on the left, this is an open roadway in the middle of the day. And it's in Rochester, New York, and that is LOSA. And on the right, that is probably LOSE or F. It's a pretty big breakdown. I see a bunch of lights, red lights that show cars stopping. And but again, from an economic perspective, where you often find the biggest breakdowns in traffic, particularly on surface roads, you find your strongest economy. You find the area that everybody's going to. In transportation, our goal is to get people through areas where if they were to travel in circles at speed and never arise, that would be LOSA. But if they travel for only 5 minutes in stop and go traffic and arrive quickly, and this is the destination, that's LOSF. That's a failure, something that has to be fixed. And we need to work at bringing the true experience of the traveler and of the local economy into the way we measure transportation. And we do all this for fear. Traffic's just the worst thing that we could possibly imagine. But what we discovered, and we looked at data from 1993 to 2017 in the largest 100 cities in the country, and we found that while freeway capacity grew faster than population, congestion exploded. And we found this all over the place. Boise, definitely one of those areas that saw a huge increase in congestion despite building more freeway capacity than population growth. And then you see places like Jackson, Mississippi that built a lot, didn't grow much, massive increase, and Buffalo, New York that built a little bit, lost a substantial amount of their population, massive increase in congestion. So all that we're doing to build roads and design roads to prevent congestion is just not working. And a lot of that has to do with these circuitous routes that we call for in the way we allow development to happen rather than clustering it like we did. That's the whole point of rural villages, right? Is to cluster everything needs. So all the needs and all the jobs and all the one-stop shopping for all the folks that live on farms around the area. Well, cities were built the same way for a long time. Now we've made even the shortest trip from, you can see home on the right, to the school on right next to it. That's a short trip as the crow flies, but it's a long trip as you drive. And I think about a map I once saw in Orlando, Florida, of two homes that are 70 feet apart, but the drive between them is 7 miles. That sort of thing, rather than really thinking about the full trip, but thinking about moving cars quickly, result in some of those oddities. Okay, now I'm going to try to do something, and I don't know.
Beth,
yeah.
Before you do that, would you be able to explain what LOS is To
It's
folks
called
who may
level
not
of
know.
service, but the term doesn't matter. Like I said, the definition is what matters. The definition is how many cars are there and how close together they are. Whether you remember the technical term for it or not important. We measure based on, you know, how many cars there are and how fast they're going. And the goal is for them to be as many as possible, going as fast as possible all day long. So, all right, tell me, oops. Oh, I might not be able to do this. I am so sorry. This is a bummer because this is a video on induced demand. Here, let me see if I can find it real quick. That is a concept that we don't really take care of much in transportation, even though we see it repeatedly. And it's one of the biggest reasons that we have trouble predicting that when we build more roadways, things will get even busier. So can you see this video, Nina?
Yes.
Okay. So let's listen to this. This is from a comedy, believe it or not, about a planning agency out of Australia. The fact that people in Australia could find comedy out of planning, God bless them.
By ingesting the 12 months worth of data you sent, that's about 2 terabytes worth.
Wow.
What you're looking at now is a typical midweek traffic flow.
Green is good, orange indicates slower than average, red is heavy.
Now we can manually input a range of external factors: wet weather, public holidays, RDOs for the industrial sector.
Breakdown on a major arterial.
That's pretty impressive.
So we've taken your project.
The road upgrade, extra lanes, on and off ramp lengthening.
We factored in all those improvements. So starting with current flow during peak, then during construction, some problems.
Of course.
And then when it opens, that's brilliant.
Amazing.
And with the machine learning, we can keep it going. Year 2, year 3, year 4.
Wait, what's going on?
What happened?
Where'd the green go? What happened? Why does the traffic get worse?
Have you heard of the Jevons paradox?
I'm hoping they're a death metal band.
It basically states that the better you make something like a road, the more people will use it. Isn't that a good thing? No, it means you spend a lot of money now for a very short-term benefit.
So there is some benefit.
Oh, sure. Average travel times crossing the city will be cut by 2.5 minutes or a little less.
Call it 2.
Really? And that lasts for 14, 15 months?
Then declines.
No, stays flat.
Then declines.
Well, for $300 billion, I guess we were hoping for something a little more dramatic.
2.5 minutes.
Call it 2.
You don't look happy.
So that's what we see pretty repeatedly in our highway building, but we don't seem to learn from it very much. And there are opportunities to learn and change. And that's one of the things I want to point out as I finish. Do want to mention that where places are walkable, that we see businesses want to move in more. It commands larger rents because there's so much more money to be made if you are in a retail area where there's foot traffic. People are willing to pay substantially more to live in a home in a walkable area, even though we don't measure this in our transportation at all. On the economic scale we do, and let me tell you, realtors do. Part of the reason people will pay so much more is we don't allow for these communities to be built. So while the demand for it has been increasing, the supply has stayed very flat. And it means that only the wealthiest can afford it because the government interferes with the market responding. So using the technology that we use in our phones to figure out by mapping where to go, you can determine how many destinations everybody has in your community. This is Madison, Wisconsin. You can see their job access by car, and the morning commute is excellent across the region. By transit, not quite as good, but still relatively impressive, particularly in the core. In terms of essential services, you'll find, and that's really all the things like groceries, schools, medical care, retail, all those sorts of things that we need to get to. And this is by walking. It's very good in the historic core, but you'll also see in little kind of more densely populated town center areas on the outside that it's pretty good. And we can use this, and actually the state of Virginia uses it very effectively right now to evaluate all of their new capacity projects of all kinds, whether it's transit or highways or roadways or walking and biking, to determine how it will impact access to jobs with a particular look at how it helps people who don't have access to a vehicle, lower income people. Now, the last thing I will point out is, this is Boise's change over the years. You built up a lot. You've added a lot of people. You put them over a large area. Cleveland did the same thing between 1948 and 2002. But they didn't grow in population. They took the same population and they spread it out across Cuyahoga County. And what happened then is the same number of people have to take care of significantly more roadway, water pipes, fire, sewer, ER, schools, police, trash pickup, all those sorts of things. It's significantly more infrastructure, but the same number of people, which means you either don't fully pay, which is what they do, and you see everything fall into disrepair, or you raise people's taxes an exorbitant amount. We also find that spreading the same number of people over a vast territory results in significantly more congestion because everyone has to go further for everything. And the cost to maintain those roadways are rarely built into long-term projections, but they are quite sizable, as you can see here. We do some fiscal analysis. I have an economic shop that I work with, and this is what we did for Macon, Georgia, where we look at different densities, and we find that in very low density, particularly new development, we bring in fewer taxes than it costs to pay for government infrastructure and services. And that only goes up as you do more infill and bring those densities up. That sort of rural small town actually has pretty high densities in it, and that's what if you want to clear your costs, what you need to do. So I think that and then in terms of the household, when you add transportation costs in, which most people don't, you really see a huge increase in cost and a lack of affordability across the board. In fact, we saw in the housing crisis of 2008, it was the increased cost of transportation that tended to lead to a lot of foreclosures because it was an unanticipated cost. Now, this may seem like something relatively unattainable to change, but the beauty is we actually know very well how to build our roadways different to be much more supportive of walking and biking and of economic development in the area because we can see it all around us. Now, we might have been a little bit better about doing this before the car because we couldn't only plan for something that didn't yet exist. But we've maintained these areas, and we do find that they are often our richest source of tax dollars, of economic activity, and the desirability of these communities have gone up across the country. So when we look at ways to change what we've built over the last 50 to 70 years, we really need look no further than our own neighbors in determining how to make space for people, because like I said, there are beautiful examples all around us. And with that, I am happy to talk about anything and answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Beth. Yeah, I think right now we can open it up for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and we can have an open discussion.
I'll ask a quick question while people are organizing their thoughts. Thank you, Beth. That was really a great presentation as usual. I learned a ton. I wanted to ask you about the difference between urban and rural. You mentioned, I think, that rural communities are leading the way on complete streets road design. Is that what you said?
I said rural America invented it. And you find the greatest examples of complete streets on rural main streets. Urban areas, often started off just like those rural towns did. It's just maybe the railroad went through there, or they were close to a port and they built up quickly. You really need to look no further than those beautiful rural main streets for examples of what I want in my urban setting. In fact, what I think people most want and what we find most people want in urban areas is to be in one little rural small town next to another rural small town. It's just they all back up against each other. I'm in a rural small town called Columbia Heights, and we are separated from our rural neighbor Mount Pleasant by one street. But that's what we're all looking for. We're looking for that town square feel. It's just mine happens to be surrounded by a bunch of other ones. So I as someone who, as a kid, I lived in a very small rural town called Ravenswood, West Virginia, where I could walk anywhere I wanted to at 10. I'm very defensive when people, almost claim that rural America is just incapable or undeserving of what they made up in the first place.
Yeah, we call ourselves a big rural state, which we are. We have a lot of open land here, as you know, in Idaho. But we do have small towns, and they do have kind of that town center feel, a small main street with, small businesses that line it. So I just thought that was a really good point. Thank you for that.
Deanna just put a question in the chat, and it says, in Idaho, many of those original main streets in small towns were also the highway, and we've destroyed many of them. What would you suggest for this impact?
Well, it is a really interesting thing. Again, where rural towns and urban areas have very similar experiences, we built many of our highways right through our most productive economic centers. And if you come to almost every urban setting, we built our highways straight through our downtowns. We're actually doing some economic analysis of highways built and planned highways not built. Like DC was supposed to have a highway that went right through it north to south. That's some of our most in-demand neighborhoods and wealthiest neighborhoods now that would have been a highway had that leg been built. But if you go to New Orleans, we built it straight through Treme. That's an area that highway has really stopped a lot of the redevelopment through. It's my hometown, so I think about it a lot. We have a lot of fixing to do, but first we have to fix our idea of what our goal is. Our goal in transportation right now is to move you through every area. Your arrival is not what we measure. Therefore, your arrival is most charitably incidental to what we measure. We assume you'll arrive, but if we don't measure it, it's not the point. We don't really care. That's when I was talking about that access to jobs measure, those access to services. That's a whole trip. That's origin to destination. That's a human being's experience. What we measure is I put a monitor here on a highway and here on a highway, and it looks like the cars are moving fast between them, but that's nobody's origin and nobody's destination. That's what I'm saying. If people just travel in circles, but at speed, that's an A grade in transportation. If you never arrive, we can still get our A. But if you're traveling in stop and go traffic, but arriving where you want to arrive very quickly, we consider that a failure that has to be intervened with, and a lot of money spent to speed up that traffic, even if speeding up that traffic means removing all the economic development around it. So we have to redefine what it is we want, what our objective of transportation is, and measure that. And we have so many tools available to us now because of the data that are available at very cheap rates all around us. And then as we define things based on what we're truly trying to accomplish, we can move in a different direction. So once you put economic development and safety above speed, you would design both the roadway going through an urban area and that rural main street very differently. What's interesting is we've come back decades later and created beltways and bypasses, because now we know putting your highway through the middle of where everyone's going to is terrible. Just from a traffic perspective, it really doesn't work. It's a really bad idea. But also from an economic perspective, it's a bad idea. I think if we built the highways knowing what we know now, we would have built them around the actual economic centers and then filtered people into that economic center in a more reasonable manner, with the idea that when you get close to where you're trying to go, to the activity center, you should expect to slow down. That's everybody's destination. And you see this in suburban areas and fringe areas too, where we build a roadway and this I know drives our transportation agencies nuts. We built it as a high-speed roadway, and then the locals come develop it all up. I think we need to move into a world where the locals allow that development. They know that the second they allow it, they're requiring those speeds to drop like a brick. Development and speed don't work together. If you want speed, you keep development away. Thus the way we built our interstates. We knew that. The whole point of the interstate system was you can't have speed by development. We have to separate these highways and not have cross streets and have careful ways to get on and off and not have people there. But now we apply it in a local setting, and what we end up getting is a terrible highway and a terrible local serving street. Just doesn't work in any way, shape, or form.
Elaine posed a question in the chat. What if the arrival goal is the big city to big city and ignoring the small ones in between, which is something we hear from DOT engineers?
Well, I think for a rural state to claim that the small communities in between are not the point seems really out of step with the population you're trying to serve. I would hope that that's not what they mean. But again, we do have our highways that connect us between big cities. What we have to decide is that the only product we're capable of delivering? You know, I've seen DOTs prove time and time again that they can deliver a high-speed roadway. What they really struggle with is a locally serving roadway. And a lot of times they say, well, that's not my business. But they kind of make it their business when they step in to those roadways in the midst of development. Or they claim they have no say over development. They do have more say than they like to believe. They certainly facilitate that development and are all too happy to build to the inefficient development. But I really struggle to believe that undercutting rural town centers could possibly be a priority of a state DOT. Like that will sacrifice those in the name of connecting big cities. And then of course, once we get to the big cities, we're willing to sacrifice the locally serving streets in the big cities. Also, that's my point the point is high speed, long distance travel. It's not that local serving. It's not that destination. And that's what we have to change. We need to stop looking at the speed of traffic, and we need to look at how many places people can get to inside and outside of a vehicle.
All right, and then we have a question about winter weather. Any advice or thoughts on how to mitigate the adverse effects of weather impacts in the cities that Eric works at, in the city of Rexburg and then at Idaho Falls? He's seen hesitancy to spend funds on complete streets or multi-use paths because they would sit unused half of the year.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell a little personal story here. My sister, who is a music teacher and mezzo-soprano, who used to work at the University of Northern Iowa, it's Iowa's music school, which is in a little town called Cedar Falls. Well, she lived in Cedar Falls, which is right next to Waterloo, where the university is. And it's a very small community that has a beautiful river that comes through and lots of hiking trails and things like this. And they very much like what's underneath that question, just abandon all outdoor activities in the winter, assuming that no one would use it. I know that in Idaho, there are many beautiful multi-use trails that especially in areas where people ski, that are left open because it's been a priority. My sister now lives in a town called Piteå, which is a little town about the size of Cedar Falls in northern Sweden. And she teaches music for the University of Luleå, which is a slightly bigger community, much like Waterloo, very close to Piteå. Now, Piteå is, like I said, northern Sweden. They don't have a lot of light, some beautiful auroras right now, but not a lot of light and a ton of snow. And their top priority is to keep the bike paths clear all year round. all year round. You can go on the city site. I can share it with folks, and they have a pecking order in terms of what they keep clear. And they've just determined it is a priority to make sure their people can be healthy and active all year round. And you know what? The people there are healthy and active all year around. She and her 10-year-old son go cross-country skiing on the cross-country paths all through the winter, which lasts a very, very long time. And they now do these super crazy late night bike rides. Like she's been out bike riding at 11 o'clock at night with her son because that's what they do. And they do it because it's available versus the United States, where we make it punishing to behave that way. And you really have to be an adventurer. And so people do that far less. And it just shows a difference in priority. And you could say, well, that's Sweden, and maybe the Swedes are different. But I find that people behave in very similar ways based on what's made available. And humans have a real interesting habit of not choosing options that don't exist. It's hard to choose the thing that you can't possibly choose. And we use the fact that we have made it dangerous and terrifying to walk as proof that people don't want to. You know, I could say, I could cook chocolate chip cookies with no sugar in them and then claim my kids don't like chocolate chip cookies. But that would be intellectually dishonest, which is what I unfortunately find in transportation a lot. I find that when Americans are visiting a walkable place, they get out of their cars. And people like me that don't enjoy driving only drive when I feel like I might die if I don't.
I love that. And I think winter maintenance questions always makes me think about Minneapolis, which I think is third in the nation for bike commute. And they sure get a lot of snow.
The folks in Minneapolis are just hardy. They're just tougher than most people. And maybe Idahoans can't compete with the Minnesotans. I mean, you all have to decide if you're as tough as they are, but they bike all year round too. So,
that's a good challenge. All right, we have two really great questions in the chat. The next one is from Deanna, and it's about freight movement often influences our highway design and speeds, but freight's arrival also should matter like a human's arrival. Is there any research analyzing this?
You know, I think that there's been a terrible lack of real good research, particularly on the public side and academic side on freight. The freight industry does a lot of look at their movements, but it's not necessarily integrated into our overall transportation approach. What's interesting is, yes, trucks often impact the way we design roads, but we do a terrible job of defining the actual truck we're talking about. So a lot of times we're designing roads for the movement of semis, when the overwhelming majority, if not all the trucks we're actually accommodating are delivery vehicles. So we have to talk a lot about the actual design vehicle. And the freight vehicles vary by an enormous amount. And the freight industry is actually extraordinarily flexible based on the area. So, the delivery vehicles that come to me on my historic block are not semis. There's no space. But they don't say, you know what, I can't get my big truck through there, so I'm just going to give up on making money in that area. No, they adjust. And so I think we need to think about that. We need to work more closely with the freight industry. There's also a lot of really great, clever, forgiving design in roadways. So a lot of times roundabouts, for example, can be built so that a truck can actually come up onto the roundabout safely, or we can allow them to cut into opposing traffic a little bit and just stop traffic a little bit further back, so that the one truck a day that comes, or the handful of trucks a day that comes, don't dominate our design and don't make it impossible to design for the much more frequent uses that we are seeking. And I think that's a big point. We need to design for what we want, not, again, act like this is a natural disaster that we have no control over.
The next question is regarding if engineers are trained to look at design from the pedestrian safety point of view rather than just the traffic flow.
Now, engineers is a large field, and it includes a very diverse group of people. What I find is, so we've gone in and worked with engineers in a whole bunch of states. From Iowa and Tennessee and Pennsylvania and North Dakota and California and Washington and Virginia and Maine. And what I do find is in every single one of those state DOTs, there are engineers that wish they could design differently, but they find two major hindrances. One is if they want to do something other than the one size fits all design that they're given, they're told to go make it up. Now, that's not very comforting to an engineer. The engineers would like alternative designs, but they're rarely given them. And where they come up with them, they have to seek a bunch of design exceptions that can be very difficult and slow. So if you decide to do something different, you're punished by a really highly regulatory, slow process. That means you won't hit your schedule or your budget. And that is, that's not going to result in you getting raises or promotions or good reviews. So in the state of Florida, when we worked there, they started looking at changing their design standards and giving people guidance, engineers guidance on how to design something differently so that they're not just constantly making up a multimodal design, and that's their choice. You can make it up and handle all the regulation that we'll put on you and the trials and the tribulations and the potential liability, or you can follow our one design and we'll make it super easy on you. And those states that are starting to really respond in that way to provide those that want to build more complete streets some real support and institutional support, they're finding many more engineers who have the desire and the ability who are doing so.
I'm gonna put in the chat a book that just came out on the topic of transportation and civil engineering by Chuck Marone from Strong Towns. Highly recommend it in terms of learning more about how the industry is currently trained within that topic. I'm not seeing any other questions. Beth, there was a lot of interest in that Swedish town, so if you want to post that link up.
I will.
We just got a comment from Deborah. When talking about safer streets, there is the argument that we are spending all available money for drivers that have to commute and drive everywhere. Yeah, I think more dedicated funding to all sorts of road users is essential going forward.
Well, and I did also see a question that I thought was a really important one, which is we are seeing these very high premiums for walkable communities, which means that those who most rely on moving around outside of a vehicle have the least access. This is often used as an excuse to not build more of it. It's actually the closest parallel I have seen is the diamond industry. Now, diamonds are incredibly common, but the diamond industry has hoarded them and only puts enough out in the market to keep the price really high. Unfortunately, that's a little bit what government has done on walkable communities. Through our land use policies, so that's all you locals, in often requiring vast parking lots for every building and pushing all the buildings further and further away, you make the community unwalkable. You combine that with roadways that are built that are, trying to connect these things that are super far away, that are designed mostly for cars because people aren't going to walk 5 miles to get between a handful of buildings. That means that those that want walkability are confined to an extraordinarily small number of communities. Now, we're all outside of college by a substantial number of years, I think, and we may not remember our introduction to economics, but when you artificially constrain the supply as the demand increases, you drive up the price. And if you want to continue to make sure only the wealthy can have access to walkable neighborhoods, we should not build any more. That will definitely keep that price high. But if we want to lower it, we just have to make it common. It needs to be everywhere, which means going back and retrofitting areas to be more walkable, which is happening everywhere. There's nothing about your community that's going to look the same in 100 years. Really, very little is going to look the same in 50 years. And I know this is scary to a lot of people, but our communities are actually changing constantly. The only question is whether or not we'll harness that for safety and economic development and quality of life, or if we'll let everything happen to us and just stay out of control.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and knowing Jim, it will be a great question. And Jim is one of our Ada County Highway District Commissioners. So Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Nina, and hi, Beth. It's good to see you. Yes, you did such a great job with the Boise Chamber of Commerce last February when you came and spoke. And
I just can't say no to people from Idaho.
Of course. So, of course, everything you've said, I have heard and is music to my ears. The challenge is that the decision makers, we're all non-experts. The policymakers are non-experts, and we get presented with just a huge amount of engineering and legal, reasons why we can't do the very things you're describing. And I know you've advised other local elected officials, state officials, people all over the country to help them sort of develop the tools and the courage and the ability to sort of overcome those walls that were presented. And it can be very frustrated. And my observation is way too often we just give up, let the engineers tell us, or the lawyers tell us we'll be sued if we don't, have these roads this wide and so forth. So any advice to those of us who are elected officials and also the advocates on the call who are advising elected officials who are not experts, and yet it's in our hands to set the budgets and make the policy priorities?
Yes. So there's actually several things that I want to say about that. One is there is no technical answer to your transportation needs. There's nothing that a spreadsheet can spit out to tell you about the sort of community you want to live in. And if you are waiting for a technical answer, you're really messing up. The engineer is the implementer of the vision set out by the policymakers and the community. I think that what has often happened is the policymakers and the community checked out years ago and left the engineers to figure it all out. And then they did. Well, now they're used to a certain system. Engineers don't like to hear that they're making policy judgments, but they actually are at this point. And so I think keeping the conversation focused on the outcome as opposed to numbers and inputs is a good place to start, because frankly, I don't care what their numbers say. If the outcome isn't what you want, it is wrong. Doesn't matter how sophisticated their process is. I would also suggest that it's important to check their work. So we put engineers in a very bad situation. We ask them to measure the unmeasurable. And then we ask that, when we actually bother to look, we catch that they didn't measure it right. Nobody knows what traffic will be like in 20 years. You don't. 20 years ago, did we predict COVID? Did we predict the housing crisis? No. We always predict traffic's going to go up. Even when it doesn't, we're often wrong. So I think starting with looking at past work and seeing how accurate it was, frankly, every DOT should be doing that check and looking for a difference between what they projected and what actually happened and asking what went wrong. What's interesting is when states do that, going back to my neighbor in Virginia, they have started admitting when they get things wrong. It has increased their popularity and support in the state an incredible amount. It will result in more trust, and those same engineers will start to catch that while they get incredibly precise numbers and answers from their models, they're just wildly inaccurate. They're precise and wrong. And so we need to check the numbers. But there's just no culture of that in transportation agencies. We should bring that in. We need to give those engineers some cover when they try something new, which institutionally we have given them none of. We really do threaten them with lawsuits if something goes wrong in the non-stereotypical roadway. I think, frankly, they are quite vulnerable to lawsuits on many of the roadways they build now, and they probably should be sued based on the predictably unsafe conditions of having high-speed roadways in areas that have heavy levels of conflict. That's an unfortunate way to go, but I'm starting to see that across the country. And I don't generally admit this, but I actually went to law school, and I can tell you that every slip lane is a great opportunity for a lawsuit and potentially my retirement plan. And then I think we need to allow a lot more experimentation and failure from our agencies, which we don't allow any of. Let them go out and do something temporary, just for their own training and knowledge, but also the community's opportunity to engage in something that isn't a sketch on a piece of paper. To see what a change feels like, to give legitimate feedback. And then if the agency can look at that experimentation as a chance to revamp all of their procedures and not just as a one-off, I think you'll see a rapid modernization of the agency. And we are starting to see that in places like Florida that is really, they've now changed their design standards so much they're running into whole new problems. And so I think that there's just a lot to learn and a lot to experiment. And if the agency will truly partner with the advocates, they can modernize and the advocates can give them some cover. And if there's no partnership, unfortunately, I think the best course of action at that point is to encourage your policymakers to set policy and to use lawsuits where DOTs insist on inherently flawed and dangerous designs.
All right, we have 3 minutes left. So if anyone has a quick question for Beth, now is the time. Oh, that's just a comment in the chat.
I'll add one if nobody else has one.
Go for it,
Beth,
Deanna.
You mentioned, but just kind of in passing, the transportation agencies, in your perspective, have more ability to respond differently to the land use patterns than they currently do. And I know that's definitely a challenge we have here. Our transportation agencies often comment that they feel like they're just reacting. They're just reacting what the land use decision makers are doing. So can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, they're both in a race to the bottom, frankly. And I put the land use officials and the transportation officials in at equal fault. I find a lot of local governments will get so frustrated with their DOT not recognizing they're creating at least half of their problem. So I'm not hanging all of this on the DOT. But the DOTs have been very happy to continue to serve bad land use patterns and not even let the locals know how what they're building won't work. And a lot of it is because their models claim that they will, in spite of the fact that everyone behind closed doors knows that they won't. So I often, when I meet with transportation engineers, bond over the typical school district. The school district that gets some cheap land on the edge of town and is going to save all this money by building their state-of-the-art school on this very cheap land. And then they build it and they go, wonder how anyone's going to get here. Didn't think of that. And then they go to the DOT and they go, hey, no one can really get here. This is a little 2-lane road, super far from where everybody we are serving lives. So it's creating massive traffic and all kinds of pollution around my school. What do I do? And the state's like, you have got to be kidding me. Yeah, like, what do you think was going to happen? I don't have this in my state transportation improvement program. And it drives every engineer completely nuts. But they kind of fuss behind closed doors and then they do it. At some point, you don't have to spend your money that way. You don't have enough money to build everything. At some point you say, look, if you choose to build in a property that's, never going to serve your use, that's on you, kid. And having decent modeling, and particularly looking at that full trip, an access to services measure, you can show that I can build this roadway. I won't actually improve much access. I might reduce how long you have to wait in line. You could work with that school before they even choose the site and say, look, if you're looking at these 3 sites, this site is going to be very expensive from a transportation perspective. And maybe the policymakers say, if you're going to choose that site, you should share in the cost of it, and therefore adjust their benefit cost analysis. Maybe that slightly more expensive property that's closer to the people they serve becomes a little more appealing when you're going to have to pay for huge transportation improvements. The other thing I will say is DOTs often usually build these very wide roadways. Well, you've already determined the land use of a wide, fast roadway. Just think about the business proposition. Who's going to build there? The lovely restaurant with outdoor seating? Because people love to sit next to 50-mile-per-hour traffic zipping by them? No. What that roadway looks like that has all kinds of outdoor seating and that vibrant, town center feel. And it's not a highway. So that highway design forecloses a lot of business and retail and development opportunity and dictates that land use design. And DOTs can do a lot to change that pattern, both by being honest. If you build out there, you will have traffic and we will not be able to spend enough money to fix it. Warning. And if I build this thing, traffic doesn't get better. In fact, in some places it gets worse. That honesty will help. And 2, recognizing that the design of your roadway dictates the development opportunities next to it. And have an honest conversation with the locals about whether or not they want to foreclose that kind of low cost, from an infrastructure perspective, high yield development.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you everyone for